Hi everybody, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. As most of you may know, February here in the United States has been designated as African American History Month, Black History Month. And so today we're going to be talking specifically about resources for African American genealogy research. I'll give you a few quick tips. I'll show you some really cool resources that are available to help you learn more about your family history, and not just to grow your tree, but also to really dig into the stories of the lives of your ancestors. And then I will give you some information about where you can go to find additional information and some other events that we have planned for the rest of the month. So with that introduction, let's dive in. A few tips to start off with. The first thing to know is that it is possible to research African American ancestry. Almost without fail, every single week on Twitter or on Facebook, I see people commenting on how it's useless to even get started because it's impossible to research, because it's you can't find out information, and that's absolutely not true. There are records available. There are some unique things available because of slavery. It created a lot of roadblocks for African American ancestry research, but it is not impossible. And so hopefully after today you'll feel a little bit more confident about that. One of the things to be aware of, and I hope I can treat this with the sensitivity it deserves, it has to do with racial designations. In records that we're going to use for genealogy research, whenever somebody was asked for a race, we need to just keep in mind that those racial designations may have changed over time. And so don't always expect your ancestor to be listed as black. They may be listed as Negro or colored, maybe even as mulatto or white if they could pass for that. And so just keep that in mind as you do your research, that if you always just put in race as black, you may be missing some records that are available. And then just keep in mind that regardless of your color or the color of your ancestors, that the first two steps in genealogy are exactly the same. Everybody starts in the same place. So if you're brand new to this, here are your first two steps, okay? The first thing is to start a family tree by entering everything you know about your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. I meet people all the time who don't know much, and that's okay. Enter what you do know. And then talk to anybody who will talk to you, and be aware that not everybody will want to talk to you or to talk about your ancestry or your family history, but find out what they know. And I would highly recommend starting with the oldest people in the family. First of all, because they're going to have the longest memories. Second of all, because they're going to know or have known many of those people in your ancestry personally. And finally, just because they may not be around that long. And if you put it off and put it off and put it off, you will regret not having talked to them if you lose the opportunity to do so. So that's the first step, and that's the first step for anyone coming into family history. You start with what you know, then you talk to members of your family to find out what they know, and you build that tree. Now the second step is just as important and just as in common with anybody else doing family history research. You start looking at recent records to document what you know and what you have been told. I'm not saying that your Grandma Sally lied. I'm just saying her memory may not be exactly accurate, not even about her own birth date, right? And so the more documentation we can find, the more likely we are to find the truth about our family history. Excuse me. Now, I say start with recent records, and one of the most recent record collections available is the 1940 U.S. Federal Census. The U.S. has a privacy law where the federal census can only be released after 72 years. So the 1940 census just came out this past April. The 1950 census won't come out for another 11 years now, for another 9 years. And so, the 1940 census is the most recent one we have available here in the U.S. Start there. Many of you may find yourselves or your parents in that census, and it will provide you with some really excellent information. Let's just look at an example so that you know what I'm talking about. If you're new to this, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. So this is the 1940 census, and I'm just going to zoom out just a little bit. You can see here that we have the names of people, lots of information available here. So this is the 1940 census for James Brown, the singer, and I don't know what you know about his history, but he was born in 1933. He was actually born in South Carolina, but the census says Georgia. So just because a record says something different than what you've been told doesn't mean that the record is right. You have to collect more records and more information to be able to come to the truth. It looks like Julia, who is the head of this household, is the one who provided the census taker with that information. And she may have just said, oh, we were all born in Georgia, not realizing that this young man who was living with her, and it says here, the son of Corey's sister, that's the relationship to the head of household. Doesn't say who Corey is, doesn't say how she's related, right? But that's what it says. And so it lists all this information about these people in this household, how much education they've had. There is their race listed here, and it's listed as Negro, where they lived in 1935, what they do for a living and how many hours they've worked and what their income is and what their address is. And it's got all this information on this census record. And so you look at that and you assimilate all the information and you look for the clues that will lead you to more information about the family. And it's really just a fun exercise to dig into these records and to start to see these snapshots of them and their lives decades and decades ago. Now, then of course you're going to want to work your way through the censuses one at a time, 1930, 1920, 1910, 1900, just working your way back. And what you'll do is you'll see people living in households as adults, and then you'll look for them living in a household as a child with their parents. And sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 people with the same name, and you'll need to maybe go back and talk to some of these people in your family and say, you know, I found this person and there's 3 of them. Here are the names of the parents of each of those 3 people. Do any of those ring a bell? Do any of those sound familiar? And just kind of work your way through those documents that way. And then you're going to get back to 1870. 1870 is a significant year for African American research because it was after emancipation. And so some of you will hit a wall there, and we'll talk in just a minute about what to do, but at least do that much. Look through the census records for that long. And one of the things that you're going to discover is that the census records look different almost every time. So for example, here is the census record for Susie. Actually, Rebecca's the head of household. Susie's down here, Susie Bailing. She's the mother of James Brown. And so if I zoom in here, you'll notice that the record looks a little bit different. There's some different information recorded. You have to look around to see if you can find the family. There they are. I'm going to zoom in on that. And it looks like Rebecca's here and she's widowed and these are her children. Susie is one of those children. It lists the birthplaces of everybody in the household and the birthplaces of their parents. If I were to scroll over a little bit, it would tell me their occupations, if any of them had served in the World War at the time. So just some really great information to tell the family story, but also some great information to give you the clues you need to just go back another generation. One of the things we do on Ancestry.com, if you look over here on the right-hand side, is every time you find a record, we give you some suggestions. Keep in mind, they're just suggestions. You have to look at them and decide if it's really the right people, but we give you some suggestions for additional records you might want to look at. So we've got this Rebecca Bailing, mother of Susie, in the 1930 census. I could then look at the 1920 census. I could look at the 1910 census. I could even go as far as looking at the 1900 census, and you notice her name changes. Now, one of the things that I know about James Brown's grandmother is that her maiden name was Bryant. And so what I've done is I've taken her from 1930, where she was a widow with some children living in her home, all the way back to 1900, where she was an 11-year-old little girl living in the home of her parents. And so that's how you do it. You just grow it one generation at a time with the information you already know, proving it out and building upon it to continue to build your tree. Now, there are a lot of other records available, both online and in local record offices and archives in the locations where your family may have lived. Most significant are going to be birth, marriage, and death records. Death records, of course, are going to be easier to find because they're more public. They're more readily available, and most of them are more recent. Marriage records might be a little bit more difficult, and birth records, surprisingly, at least this surprises a lot of people, most states did not start keeping birth records until the early 1900s. So prior to that, you're going to have to go to a local county or even to the church where your ancestors may have been baptized or christened as a child. So you have to get a little bit more creative, but death records for sure you should be able to find. Now, let's talk about some resources available to those of you who are doing African American research. There are some excellent resources available, and Ancestry has most recently created this page. If you could just go to ancestry.com/African American, it will take you to a page that, see if I can get to the right tab here. Let's close some of these. It will take you to a page that looks like this. And basically what we've done is we've provided you just this one-stop, one-view place where you can get a lot of information that will help with your research. The first thing I would encourage you strongly to do is you'll see this tiny little link right here, and you might not even be able to see it on your screen right now, but if you follow the little yellow dot, hopefully you can see where on the page I'm pointing to. There's a link here to download our free research guide. I would encourage you to do that. It's 3 or 4 pages long. You can print it out and keep it handy. And it gives some excellent tips and tricks. It covers most of the stuff that I'm covering today and goes a little bit more in depth to a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about. So download that and have that handy. Okay. So the free resource guide, that's the first thing that I would encourage you to do. The second thing I would encourage you to do, and this is before you start searching or anything else, is just explore the record collections. One of the things that I do as a genealogist is anytime I start to research a new ethnicity or a new location or a new decade or time period is I want to become familiar with what records even exist, what records were created, what records might help me solve my problem. And so there are a couple of things we've done here to help you do that. Let me scroll up on this image just a little bit. As cute as that little girl is, we need to move her off the screen here. Okay, so here we've got kind of like this little carousel where you can click through, and there's a little find out more link on every one of these where you can learn more about military records or the Freedman Bank records or what other state or local collections are available for the place where your ancestor lived, what kinds of printed material is available that might have biographical sketches or memorials or photos. In this case, we're highlighting the California African American Who's Who from 1948. There's a whole collection of interviews with former slaves that was done by the WPA in the 1930s during the Depression, 2,300 stories from former slaves. And so while your ancestor might not have been one of those 2,300 people interviewed, some of those people talked about the plantation owners. They talked about other people that they were enslaved with. So your ancestor or the slaveholder may be mentioned in some of those interviews. So it's worth looking into. Of course, we've talked about the federal census. We'll talk in just a minute a little bit more about slave schedules and mortality schedules. So those are just some of the highlights of records that we've provided here, and there's a little link to find out more information about those. Then over here on the left-hand side, we have a list of featured collections. And basically what these are is these are databases that we know contain records specifically about African Americans only. So lists of colored troops in the Civil War, the entire troops full of colored soldiers. There are a couple of Caribbean slave records that go all the way back to the 1600s. So we've got the Danish West Indies, we've got St. Croix, and I thought there was one more, I maybe have been mistaken. And these are all brand new records that have just come online within the last few weeks. We have Buffalo Soldiers returns. Buffalo Soldiers were, again, troops of African Americans. It started in the Civil War, but went all the way through World War I. So if your ancestor served in the military, those are excellent records. Here's that California American Who's Who, those interviews with former slaves. These are just links directly to those databases so that you can search them specifically. Slave ads and abstracts out of newspaper collections, slave manifests. There was a law passed in the early 1800s about slave traffic in international waters, and it required that anybody who was bringing in into port ships with slaves on them had to fill out complete manifests with descriptions of those individuals so that they could be accounted for. And those are huge. Those are significant, important documents that will provide you great clues to your ancestors' lives. Emancipation records, owner petitions, just all sorts of really great records. Now, one of the things that I would encourage you to do, again, anytime you find a record collection that you think is interesting or might have information about your ancestor, you can click on it and it takes you to this database. Now, the temptation is, of course, and I suffer from this malady as well, is to just fill in the names and to start searching. But I would really encourage you, before you do that, to just scroll down past those search boxes and to read about the records. It'll help you understand better how to search them, and also if you find something, it'll help you better understand what it is exactly that you're looking at. So in this source information, there are a couple of things you're going to find out. First of all, you're going to find out where the records came from. In this case, the New Orleans, Louisiana slave manifests came from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. That's where Ancestry.com obtained those records. Sometimes we obtain them from private collectors. Sometimes they're things that local genealogical societies have put together. So it helps you determine the validity of the records and the significance of the records and the officialness, is that even a word, of the records by knowing where they came from. Just above that, you may notice here it says that these records were indexed by the Ancestry World Archives Project contributors. That is our community indexing project that Ancestry.com started 4 or 5 years ago. And anything that is indexed by that community, by those contributors, is free. So you do not have to have a subscription to search this database because it was indexed by those volunteers, those contributors. So anytime you see that, that is a free database that you can search without a subscription. Now, just below that source information, you're going to see some historical background. You're going to see some information about the database. Like, for example, even though this database starts in 1807, not all the manifests survived. So there's some gaps in those years. It looks like 1813 to 1817, there's nothing, 1837 and 1859. And things get lost for a variety of reasons, but it's helpful to know that so that you don't keep searching and searching and thinking either I can't find them, they're in there and I'm just never going to find them, or excuse me, maybe they never came through this port, or maybe this, if your ancestor came during that time period or it was brought over during that time period, you're not going to find them. They're not going to be in this particular record collection. So it's useful to know that before you start searching. It'll lessen your frustration, trust me. And then below that historical information about the database, we have some descriptions about how to use the record, what information has been indexed, what additional information is available. And so let me just give you an example here. Anytime you see a little browse collection box over here, it means there are images attached to that particular database. And so when you search it, what you're going to discover, so you do a search and you find somebody who might be the person that you're looking for. This is what we call the record page. This is the stuff that was indexed off the record. So we have the name, and you will discover this very quickly, especially in slavery records, that most slaves did not have last names until after emancipation. And so they were listed by first name only because that is the only name, at least here in this country, that they carried. And the birth year, the name of the ship that they came over on, where they were being transported from, and in this case, it looks like this ship was coming from Alexandria, Virginia, up by Washington, D.C., and then coming down to New Orleans. And the date that it arrived, how old she was at the time, which is how we estimated that birth year, who the ship owner was, and where that ship owner resided. Now, this is great. This is excellent information, but don't stop there. Always, if there is an image attached, always go look at the image for two reasons. First of all, it's possible that the indexer may have gotten something wrong. They may have read it and seen something different than what you see because you know these people, right? But also because there's additional information on here that wasn't indexed. For example, and I love this because this is where we start to really tell the stories of our families. There is information here about their height and their complexion. Now, we didn't index that information because that's not going to necessarily help you search. But on the image, you can see it, and it can give you an idea, a greater idea or a greater understanding of your ancestor. So, for example, you'll see several of these men, 5'8.5", 5'6", 5'6", and these are men who are in their 20s and late teens. It helps you understand that, height has changed over time. Here's a man who is 19 years old, who is 4'8" and 3/4. It just helps you get an idea or a better idea of your ancestors when you can see some of these details on some of these records. You'll also notice over here, it looks like on this record, there are two designations for complexion, black or yellow. And so you can start to see, and you may see little, like here it looks like somebody has written in after the fact that they disagreed with the original person who recorded this information. So it just gives you a better understanding. And don't just read the information about your ancestor. Anytime you find a record, a census record, a slave manifest, a newspaper, whatever it may be, always look at it in context. Look at all of the information on the page, right? Could some of these people be siblings? Are there other family members who may have lived with them or been transported with them? Look at all of the information in all of the other columns. It gives you an idea of comparison, how your ancestor may have compared to the other people that they associated and affiliated with. But it also helps you get familiar with or give you clues to what to do next. So I always make sure I look at the full record in context and always view that image. So hopefully that's just given you an idea of the types of records that are available and some of the record collections that you can explore. Then, do you love this? We've done all of this. Then you can go search for your ancestors. Now, if you've already started your tree, hopefully you'll start to see what we call our shaky leaf hints. On this page, you'll see here that one of my trees has 21 hints from the African American collection. So I have African Americans in my family tree, cousins and distant aunts and uncles, and so it's giving me hints about people that might be showing up in African American databases that are in my family tree. And so I can just go straight to those to see, is this my person or is this not my person? So use those hints even before you search. Then you can start to search. So I can come over here and I can put in whatever information I know, and you can put in as much or as little information. You could fill it all in, you could fill just the name in, and then I'm going to go ahead and click search, and it's going to take me to some search results. Now your search results may look a little bit like this when you first get them. Okay, it's just a list of ranked search results based on the information that you searched for and how closely we think it matches. The more information you put in, the more likely these are to be ranked correctly. I always do that and then look at what comes up at the top of the list and see if those are interesting. But then I very quickly come up here and change this view to summarize by category, because then I can look at specific databases to determine if that's something that I'm interested in. Now remember, I did this search directly from the African American landing page or web page, and so it's only showing me African American specific record collections. There are other record collections that include African Americans with the rest of the population, and it's not going to show me those. So if you want to search those, you just need to click search and come in here and fill in this search box. And so I could come in here and look for Fred Williams. And then what I might want to do to restrict my search, I can change this right here to African American. And what that does essentially is, instead of typing in black and marking it exact, it captures all people who are racially designated as African Americans, so that black, Negro, colored, mulatto. And then it doesn't eliminate the people who are white, it just moves them further down the list. So I can come in here and I can say, okay, I'm looking for Fred Williams in the 1940 census. And I can just work my way through those record collections like that. I hope that makes some sense. If you need to watch that part of the video again, feel free to do that when we archive this later on YouTube, just so you can catch how that works exactly. Once you hit that 1870 wall, and we'll talk, this is the last thing that we'll talk about today. Once you hit that 1870 census, a lot of people think that they're stuck, that they can't go back any further. The question you need to ask is, was your ancestor free or enslaved? If you've traced your ancestor back to a northern state, chances are they were free. If they were living in the South, it's highly probable that they were enslaved. But don't just automatically make that assumption. Many slaves were freed long before emancipation. So check the 1860 census and the 1850 census for your ancestor to see if they show up there as a free person of color. That becomes really important, because if you just assume that they were enslaved, a lot of times what I see is African Americans stop doing their research there because they just assume they can't do any more. And it's been really neat. I've helped some people where they've just discovered that their ancestors, the people that they thought had been born into slavery, were actually not. They were actually born free, and it was the previous generation that had been freed by the slaveholders. And so don't just make the assumption, just because your ancestor was living in the South, that they were enslaved until emancipation. Check those two censuses. And then, if they were enslaved, what you're going to need to do is change your thinking just a little bit, and you're going to need to refocus your research on the family of the slaveholder. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do. The first one, and again, this is just a general guideline, don't make the automatic assumption. Many slaves took the name of their slaveholder as their surname, and so you can start there. The second thing you can do is you can look for property records, land records. Look at the clues in the census. If your ancestor is living in Mississippi but they were born in Georgia, if they were living in Mississippi in 1870, but they were born in Georgia, what you need to do is look in Mississippi, in the county that they were living in, for land transactions for somebody who purchased land who moved there from Georgia, right? So you have to start thinking about who it was that would have brought them there if they were enslaved. And property records can be a big help. Also, in 1850 and 1860, there were slave schedules created. So you can go through the slave schedules, and we do have those online. They're a separate database from the census, even though they were taken at the same time as the census, 1850 and 1860. And it'll list the slaveholder and then all of their slaves by gender and age. And so if you know, again, for example, that in 1870 your great-grandfather was living in a very specific county in Mississippi, check the 1860 slave schedule for that specific county in Mississippi and see if you can identify someone, a male slave who is about the right age as your father, or your grandfather, who may or may not be living with a slaveholder who has the same name. At least make note of all of the possibilities, and then you can work to narrow that list down. Also keep in mind military records, particularly the Civil War. There were colored troops, there were men who went into battle or were brought or sent into battle by in the South. And so look for those military records. And then shortly after, so there's this whole collection of Freedman's Bureau and Freedman's Bank records. The Freedman's Bureau was specifically for people who had been enslaved, to give them a place to bank, and some information was recorded when they created those banking records about their previous lives. So search those records. We've talked about the slave manifests. Check wills and probate records. If your ancestor's living in a specific county, look for the wills and probate records of the slave owners in the area. Very, very often they mentioned their slaves by name in those records, and so you can search those. Look for manumission and emancipation papers. Now, we don't have, I don't think, any of these online, but you could access them through the local county where your ancestor may have lived. Check the newspapers. Newspapers are a huge boon to genealogy research. Maybe look for an obituary for your ancestor that lists information about about exactly where they were born, or who they were enslaved to. There are also slave ads that come in handy. And then the final thing that I would just encourage you to do is to take the new Ancestry DNA test. We just started issuing this test not quite a year ago, and so we're building our database, but the more people that take it, the more likely you are to make some of those connections. What we do is we compare your DNA to everybody else's in our database, and you may find that you connect with first or second or third or fourth cousins. If you connect with a fourth cousin, that means you have the same third great-grandfather. Third great-grandfathers, for most of us that are middle-aged, are people who were born in about 1800 to 1820. And so if they've done research and discovered who their third great-grandfather is, and it shows that you are their fourth cousin, now all of a sudden you have a possible lead on who your third great-grandfather might be. That might have sounded a little confusing now that I've said it out loud, but hopefully it makes sense. If it doesn't, or if you have additional questions, if you're watching this presentation live, I will be available on chat in just a few minutes to answer any additional questions you may have. If you're watching an archived version of this on our YouTube channel, the URL there is at the bottom of your screen. You can leave a comment. I do monitor those and will answer them as necessary. If you have some additional questions that you'd like specifically answered in maybe a future presentation, you can email at ask@ancestry.com. I review all of those, and then that's how I put together these presentations, is based on the kinds of questions that I'm getting from people. And if I get the same question over and over, I know that it's time to teach you something new or something additional that you need to know to be successful in your family history search. That is all we have time for today. As a matter of fact, it looks like we went about 3 or 4 minutes over. But there was a lot to cover, and I know that this is so important for so many of you to discover your heritage, and it's something that a lot of African Americans have thought was not entirely possible, but it is possible, and there are records available. You just have to know how to dig into them, and hopefully this has given you a head start into that. To further this, if you join me on the 19th of this month, so the 19th of February, I will have Lisa Lee. She's a professional genealogist with a lot of experience in African American record collections and some really specific African American record collections that she has found great success with, and she'll be with me to talk about that and to teach you about that. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.